This is Citizens Going Wild, by the way. This is George and Larry, and we're all in a bad mood. This is an article that appeared by Melanie Phillips, and the title is just good. The Pathology of Evil. Once again, the media's gleeful alacrity to demonize Israel is frightening. The main question she has, and that I have, is why do they treat Israel differently than they treat every other nation on earth in the history of the earth? Israel is held to different standards than any other nation I know of. You have an obvious case, in my opinion. No, it's objectively true that you have good versus evil. One group of terrorists send thousands of rockets to kill civilians. In another country, Israel fires back, taking extraordinary measures to avoid civilian casualties. The result is Israel gets yelled at day and night, and Israel's enemies get to be called terrorists? No. Even in the Wall Street Journal, they're called militants. Are there no terrorists left in the Middle East? It is absolutely maddening. And I don't have any answers to this sort of crazy business.
George?
Yes.
To me, another question, and it may be part of the same thing, and I don't have an answer, is why is Israel, that is so good technologically, militarily, and otherwise, so bad with PR? Or is it the fact that basically the world is anti-Semitic and no matter what we do, it doesn't matter?
I think you've hit the nail on the head, except that I don't think it's a question of public relations. I think it's a question of people determined to hate Jews. And no matter what they do, this is the result. I thought this was the case, what you're saying, why are we so bad at PR? We're actually pretty prominent in PR in this country and in Israel, but there's nothing we can do. I mean, if we can't have the support of the world when we're defending ourselves against terrorists by definition, and then there's nothing you can do. There's nothing you can say that will make any difference at all.
What makes it even more maddening to me is the fact, and I sent an article out, I think this morning, that several people in Hamas have basically said, look, this isn't Israel we're really fighting, this is the whole Western world. And until they realize that Allah is meant to rule all of you, this is the way it's going to be.
That's true. You're absolutely right. And yet, the world's media does not take cognizance of that. Look at another incident that happened here in New York and California. For the first time, I've seen the incredible hatred, intensity that I haven't seen since the Holocaust. There was a guy who picked up a stanchion, one of those metal devices that holds the rope that separates one group from another group, and he was going to smash it in the head of a Jew that he didn't even know. And there was very little mention of this, the intensity of the hate.
The guy who was one of the guys who was caught in New York is an Arab, Wahim or Wasim, somebody or other, yeah. And it's basically Jew hatred.
Well,
what is also the only one who defended the Jews that were in that diner or sushi place in Los Angeles was a Lebanese immigrant who worked there.
Really?
Yes.
In New York, there was a guy, kind of a tall, big guy, who helped the Jews. Not enough, but he tried to do all he could, and he did that, and he deserves credit. But did you see the way people just sort of rolled right up and started hitting the Jews?
So what does this mean? Do we have to go back? Should we now have to form Jewish defense leagues like Maya Kahani wanted?
That's an interesting question. Jews are always against owning guns and learning defense and all that sort of stuff. And I noticed here in the New York Times article that the guy who was beaten on in New York said, "I just don't understand it." I think that's false. I mean, he's the victim. I feel sorry for him, and no blame lays on him. But I think he knows very well why this is done. What he doesn't want to do is acknowledge why this was being done. They weren't hitting the Amish. They weren't hitting Presbyterians, and goodness knows they weren't hitting Episcopalians.
Does that now mean that we now, we're going to have to stop wearing yarmulkes, and if we want to, and stop wearing mezuzah, mug and dovids or whatever?
Well, what I think the only thing that will stop this is if these guys are sentenced to like 20 years in jail or 10 years in jail.
Not going to happen.
Yeah, that's what I'm afraid it is.
Look what happened in Riverdale, New York, which happened to be an area that has a fairly large Orthodox Jewish population. I know it. My brother lives there.
Yeah.
He's not Orthodox, by the way. But they caught this black guy who was vandalizing synagogues, and he had done a number of them.
Oh, yeah.
And they finally caught him, and he was brought to a judge who had him locked up. But instead of doing that, the defender went to another judge who let him go in his own recognizance.
I didn't even know you could do that sort of thing. But apparently you can if you hit a Jew or you're.
Oh, this is modern America.
This is so startling to me. I mean, I'm used to stuff on college campuses, the insults and all that. But to actually go out and there's a famous picture during the Holocaust of some prisoners who were let out of prison, and they're beating Jews who are basically on the ground. And there's this one huge guy who's got a huge pipe, and he's bringing it down on the head of a Jew who's on the pavement already. This reminds me of that it just goes on and on and on. Plus, if you remember the last time they had an outbreak of anti-Semitism in Los Angeles, where they attacked a number of Jewish restaurants and places, and nothing, as far as I know, was ever done about this. And I think
we're now busy talking. In fact, I just sent something out to Senator Menendez this morning saying, you just sent me a letter about anti-Asian hate and anti-Asian racism, etc. Where are you on anti-Jewish hate and race and etc.? Especially since up until now you've been a firm supporter of Israel, and this time you waffled on it.
That is actually the most worrisome thing of all. He has been a stalwart. When he was in trouble, by the way, the Jews stuck with him to the.
I pointed that out to him. And by the way, I actually know, not well, but I know his press secretary, who was a patient of mine for many years, and who I've known since a relatively young boy growing up.
Do you think that this Menendez, what he did, which was basically attack Israel during the time of tribulation, do you think this is a sign that the woke people have taken over the Democratic Party and everyone?
Absolutely. I think that he's afraid, although I don't quite understand it because he doesn't get elected. He doesn't come up for election for another 5 years. But I think that the woke Democrats are taking over the party, and while Biden is still not quite doing what they want him to, this is the future of the Democratic Party, unfortunately.
Why? I mean,
I'll tell you simply why. They have figured out that there are going to be more Muslim voters in the United States than Jews. And that's what it comes down, pure and simple, which is the same reason why they want to get illegal immigrants in here, to make them voters so that they can all vote.
That is very discouraging. And even at this point, they're the loudest, most confident portion of the Democratic Party, you're saying.
Well, they're certainly the loudest, and look what Joe Biden did recently. Joe Biden went up last week and told Rashida Tlaib how strong and how powerful she is for standing up for her beliefs.
After she was attacked for
He
attack.
pointed her out specifically.
I'm still not sure if Joe is all there or not, but what part remains, it makes me very nervous, his attitude. And
Well, no, look, I mean, after all is said and done, he has supported Israel this time, but he's doing it against the wishes of his party.
But yes, that's correct. And he is also going back to the two-state solution just after Trump, or I guess Trump's son, has worked out an alternative way of bringing peace to the Middle East, which is to kind of isolate the Palestinians.
None of it makes any sense to me because even some Arab states are quietly, if you notice, Abu Dhabi and the United Arab Emirates and everything did not come out strongly for Hamas this time.
Yeah.
Even Saudi Arabia did not come out strongly for Hamas this time. It was all very quiet. The only ones who came out really strong for Hamas were Iran.
That's about it.
And all the Western countries.
Well, yeah, okay. And I'm looking at this article where it says dozens arrested in Manhattan as Gaza protests turned violent. They didn't just turn violent. This is Arabs attack Jews. That's what happened, and that's usually.
But look what the New York Times is. The New York Times has been an apologist for anti-Semites for the last 10 to 15 years.
Just remarkable, just more remarkable.
Which is one of the reasons why I don't subscribe to it anymore, even though it's a wonderful paper in other respects.
That's the thing, it really is. And they're the only newspaper that covers the waterfront. Plus, I want to keep up with my enemy. In the same way, if I were a doctor who dealt with cancer patients, I would probably subscribe to the Journal of, oncology, I guess. So I just want to know.
Yeah, but that at least gives me truth and not lies.
Well, that's true. Their aim is truth. This aim, by the way, they have stepped it up since this recent war. They have stepped things up. There's almost an article a day, or at least a letter to the editor a day that takes that is the anti-Israel side. Here's a letter where this guy is talking about the dispossession of the Palestinian people. Now, anyone who reads the New York
Who wrote it? What's the name behind it?
No, this is a Jewish guy. Jacob Bender, Philadelphia.
Wait, so we have a bunch of self-hating Jews.
That's exactly what we have. But they don't have to print his letter. And the whole idea of dispossession is just silliness. First of all, there were never people called Palestinians that referred to Arabs. Second of all, they weren't possessed of the land. Any Arab who has a deed to the land owns that land. 20% of the Israeli population.
Let's get even a little more specific. This whole Sheikh Jarif thing in Jerusalem, that is supposedly, and I say very air quotes, supposedly the cause of this, it's actually Israeli land. The Jews have deeds for it back to 1865, when in the 1948 war, the Arabs kicked the Jews out. When we came in, the Jews had deed for the land. The four families that are sitting there are squatters. When the people who owned the land said, we will let you stay there, you just have to continue to pay us rent. Hamas basically had said to them, stop paying rent and we will support you.
And
this is all a gummed up thing.
it is a ginned up situation. The incident that Larry is talking about is an incident where the Israelis decided to remove people who were illegally squatting for a long time. And the Arabs fought back against being removed for illegally squatting. And this was used as an excuse to strike out at Israel. But how many times was this reported correctly? I mean, the whole idea of being.
Look, also, look what happened in the Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Yeah.
The Al-Aqsa Mosque, they were storing weapons and rocks, etc. And, it wasn't a holy place. It's as if we were storing weapons in the synagogue.
I know.
And then they claimed that the Jewish police were coming in to attack them. Well, you incite me, I'll attack. And as you know, the Al-Aqsa Mosque sits on top of the West Wailing Wall. So it's very easy to throw stones and rocks down on the people below.
There is not a single mention of Jerusalem in the Quran. There is a mention of a place where Allah ascended to heaven.
Right.
Sorry, where the
Well, Muhammad ascended to heaven, yes.
To heaven. But that's it. And it's mentioned hundreds of times in the Jewish Bible. Let me go on to some other stuff here before I bust the gut, and that wouldn't help us. This is a guy who's defending Israel, and he says, it's an Arab-Jew conflict. That's what I would like the media to say, because that's honest. It's not one group of people against another people. It's the Jews in particular, against the Arabs. And
wait a minute, George. They claim it's not anti-Semitism, it's anti-Zionism. But when you listen to the marchers, it's death to the Jews, not death to the Israelis.
That's right. And that's something that should be remarked upon in the newscast. It is an anti-Jewish thing. They don't hate Israel because of the way it's shaped. They hate it because Jews control their own destiny. And here's a comment: Israel is not called occupiers by the Arab leaders because of the West Bank. It is because the Arabs consider all of Israel to be theirs. There's no end to their desire to eliminate Israel. And this goes on for a long time here. And yet it has no resonance with most Americans because the media plays along with this nonsense.
It's interesting. Do you know that in LA, when they attacked that people, they were stopping people at this restaurant and asking them, "Are you Jewish?" And if they said yes, then they beat them up. This sounds like shades of the SA in 1932 in Germany.
This was in Los Angeles. I didn't know that. And yet no one makes a fuss about it. I barely.
If we control the media so well, how come?
Right. Right. I once had a kid in class say we control the media. And yes, if the New York Times, if we control that, why would we make it into such a anti-Jew?
I think it's the same thing where Hitler said the Jews both controlled the Communist Party and the capitalists. So we controlled everything because we controlled both parties. Yeah, you can't win for losing.
No, and in Russia, the Jews got beat up when the people who supported the Tsar came by because they were considered communists. And when the communists came by, they were beat up and killed because they were considered capitalists. It has nothing to do with facts on this earth. That's the problem. Here was a comment where someone asked an interesting question. How can Israel be called a military superpower when they can't deal with puny Hamas goons who bomb them from next door in Gaza? And the answer this guy gives is they can. If they wanted to act like Hamas act, if they wanted to act like the Nazis act, they could wipe these people out in an hour. But they go to extraordinary lengths to avoid civilian casualties and not destroy the whole area. so that the people in the area won't suffer that much. And what has happened is Jews are basically being punished for their sins. It is maddening as hell here. And did you notice, by the way, in all the reporting, they always made a big fuss about the number of civilian casualties, and this fuss about civilian casualties, which were always mentioned as being as Muslims, just went on and on and on.
Well, first of all, the civilian casualties. Number one, when you stick weapons among hospitals and among schools and everything like this. Number two, they're not mentioning that a number of the civilian casualties were from their own rockets that blew up before they landed in Gaza.
And it wasn't in the media. It certainly wasn't emphasized in the media that these people were killing themselves, and they consider that a victory. Someone said, look, 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 they lost, but they didn't lose. They didn't lose in the court of public.
It was a PR war, a victory.
Yes. By the way, there have been some minor victories in the struggle of old-fashioned liberalism against leftists in colleges and universities. So far, the victories have only been in the smaller colleges. And I'll tell you in a second about this Linfield University. But a lot of the smaller colleges and universities are going out of business. They're under tremendous pressure, monetary pressure, budget pressure, and they're actually eliminating departments. They're firing tenured professors, which you can do if you eliminate the whole department. And they're making a big change. In addition, they're moving from liberal arts to practical programs where someone can earn a living after they graduate. And this happened in Linfield University, where a president, a black president, interestingly enough, came there. They were losing money. And he said, look, we're going to eliminate some liberal arts areas. We're going to emphasize practical programs like becoming a nurse. And he had tremendous success here. The recent graduate of Linfield, before he got in charge, was $20,000 for a psychology degree. Now the average income of a Linfield graduate who becomes a nurse is $83,000, which I think is much more. And the guy had to put up with a lot of abuse. He was accused of anti-Semitism and everything else, but he stayed the course. And I think if you had a black president, for example, at Rutgers, he could do the same type of thing. I don't think he has.
You do have a black president at Rutgers.
I know that, but I don't think he has. He's a very nice person, but I don't think he's inclined to go against the grain. That takes a lot of courage indeed.
George, you know what our problem is?
What?
We were born 20 years too late.
Too late? Why?
We're watching the decline of American exceptionalism.
I think, yes.
And we're being riven, instead of being American, we're being riven into individual races and individual creeds, and they're trying to divide us.
Yes. And the only thing that keeps us from flying apart is the idea of individualism, that every citizen will be judged as equal to every other citizen. And we won't emphasize the secondary characteristic of being human, like race, like religion, like all these other factors that people use to define their group. The one time that we emphasized race, we went to hell in a handbasket and we had the Civil War. You would think that would be enough of a lesson, but apparently it is not. I want to mention something. I would like to get hold of a guy who's campaigning for office, for national office, and I'd offer these ideas. I don't know if anyone is going to listen to me, but look, First of all, if the Republicans are going to win, they have to have some positive programs, for God's sake. You can't just be against all the time and win every time. They could
And they have to jettison Trump.
well, that's another problem. But let's look at the positive programs they could have without even mentioning Trump, because I think mentioning Trump could get them in a lot of trouble. Healthcare. We already have universal health care in most states. There are 14 states, the poorer states naturally, that don't have Medicaid for all. And we could just, one thing we could do is just say, look, they only have to pay 10%. That is, a state such as Mississippi, if they wanted to join Medicaid, has to pay 10% of the cost. They should say you don't have to pay any of the cost. We're insuring, in effect, all of your citizens, whether you like it or not. And I doubt if anyone would try to eliminate it, but it wouldn't make any difference if they did. Medicaid for all is just fine. The second thing they could do is, I think they should do something wild, like have a military defense treaty for Israel. Now, of course, I am a Zionist, so I wouldn't believe that. But in effect, it gives the Republicans something where they have the moral high ground. I mean, in general, most people think the Democrats have the moral high ground regarding racism and black people. But here you could also have the moral high ground, and by standing up for Israel and saying a defense treaty. To me, it seems morally grotesque that after the Holocaust, America has defended the Germans, but not the Jews. We really didn't supply weapons or anything else for Israel until 1967, at which point the French, who was supplying jet aircraft to Israel, in the middle of the war, decide they're not going to do
Going
it.
to Chick-fil-A to bring back lunch, and
What?
looks like it's about half done.
Now, my wife is talking to me for a minute.
Oh, okay.
Okay?
All right. That would be another thing. The other thing is to change affirmative action. I believe in affirmative action for Black Americans. Those who are enslaved come from families who are enslaved in America. No one else, except we should also add one group, and that's military family. In military families, if the father is greatly wounded, the father and the child should get some scholarship help. And if the father died fighting for this country, then the children.
Wait, George, I not only agree with you, but I'm a firm believer that affirmative action has not worked. We have been throwing money at affirmative action since the late 1960s. And if anything, it really has not helped as much as we think it had. It should have.
Well, I might disagree. I think that it has helped African Americans. It has helped the African Americans at the top.
Right, but again, if you look at Daniel Patrick Moynihan and some of his writing, what's happened is that rather than bringing everybody up to a certain level, basically we have, by throwing money at them and giving them money with no consequences, that basically we have lowered everybody to a lower level.
Well,
You're now seeing more single family white people rather than, and we are lowering every standard we have.
but I don't think that that is because of affirmative action. I want to go on to one more thing. And I just want to ask people, what happened the last time Jews did not have a piece of land which they controlled? What happened? You had the massacre of the Jews.
Well, but George, you're again talking logically. Guess what? Anti-Semitism knows no logic. It's
Yeah,
irrational, not rational.
yeah, you're right. I'm in a kind of a sour mood today, so I'm not going to read any of your jokes. If you remember any of them, you can say them. Otherwise, I'm going to call an end to this right now. Is that okay?
I don't remember any notes. I don't remember anything of anything.
Now, don't give your enemies that sort of thing to say.